So will you please help me welcome to Western Michigan University, into the heart of the Student Center, Lindsay Wren.
Thank you. So I don't think, this is not the title that they gave me for this presentation, but since this is my first opportunity today to speak without my wonderful colleague Joe Cohn interrupting me, that's a joke. I love Joe. Anyway, I thought I would just talk about my favorite subject and sort of eschew a little bit, not totally though, the topic that was given to me, and instead talk mostly about press issues. But I want to talk about student press because we have these lovely people from campus media here. I want to talk about student press as sort of a window into one means by which free expression can really flourish on campus. Looks like, did you have something you wanted to add? Please.
You want me to do that now? Joining us from the Western Herald, our news editor, Nicole Morehouse. Yay! Nicole is also the co-host of the Western News Review, a show that airs on 89.1 Wider FM on Mondays at 9, is that correct? All right. She studies digital media and journalism here at Western and will graduate in the spring of 24. Yay! And also to my right, Daniel Abo. Daniel is the host of the Western News Review on Wider, also does Afro Strings on Thursdays from 4 to 5, getting his master's in communication, and will also graduate in spring of 24. So welcome.
Awesome. Well, like I said, I'm really excited to be here with both of you. I was saying earlier today that one of my favorite parts of my job is when I get to do campus visits and see student journalists like in person, in real life, because I spend most of my day, 40 hours a week at work, sitting at my desk, emailing with people like you. So it's nice to like actually see real people. But anyway, so we're gonna talk a little bit about freedom of the press on campus, but as a window into what freedom of expression on campus can look like in general. And as we're also going to look at it a little bit as a way that folks who aren't necessarily part of student media can use the press on campus as a window into a really good campus culture on free speech. So before I get started though, I kind of want to know who I'm talking to, and I'm not going to like go around and ask all of your names because that would be insane. There's a lot of you. But what I would like to know is how many of you are part of campus media? Okay, so not most of you. How many of you are like in student government? Anyone? Okay, I have a few people. How many of you are in some other sort of like leadership position in like a student org or, you know, in other ways on campus? Okay. How many of you are students who don't fall into any of those categories? Cool. And how many of you are faculty, staff? Okay, awesome. That's great. I think that this is going to be pertinent to all of you. There's going to be parts that are a little more pertinent to my student journalists in the room, but this is really all going to be pertinent to all of you. I don't know where the pen went. Oh, it went. Oh, okay, sorry. New technology is hard. Okay, so I think that we need to start by talking about the First Amendment. This is something that I don't think we've really done today, that we need to define where we're coming from, which is this First Amendment part of our Constitution, which obviously includes the right to freedom of the press. When you're on a public college campus, this is where you're getting your rights to speak as an individual. This is also where your friends who are student journalists or are part of campus media otherwise are also getting their rights to freedom of the press. These two things are inextricably tied to one another, especially when you look at the case law. The rights of the press are really commensurate with the rights of speakers in general. So if you're talking about censoring, you know, the student newspaper or the student radio station, you're talking about creating a culture of censorship that is going to drip outside of that onto other speakers also, and vice versa. I just need to use the pen. Okay, so I just really quickly want to talk about what censorship of student media looks like. And these are all real things that I have had folks call, I run the Student Press Freedom Initiative at FIRE, which is our initiative that's totally devoted to supporting student journalists. We have a 24/7 hotline for student journalists to call whenever they have censorship issues, legal questions, anything like that. 2 in the morning, trying to get your paper put together, they can call. And these are all things that we've really seen happen at institutions. So things like requiring student journalists submit their quotes that they're going to publish before it goes to print. Things like saying, hey, all those staff and faculty who raised your hand earlier, and you could add any of you who might be student employees on campus, you're not allowed to speak to the Western Herald unless you get prior permission by our friend Keith at the General Counsel's office or by our friends at the Communications office. That's another really common form of censorship we see that really affects the press. We also see things like funding, where maybe y'all on your radio station, maybe they don't like the podcast that we recorded earlier today. They're really upset about it. And now you see, oh, never mind, you can't have that nice studio that we just built for you. Go find yourself somewhere else to be, right? Hopefully that doesn't happen. Call me if it does. So these are all forms of censorship that we see in campus media that can really start, like I said, to trickle out into the general culture on campus. Okay. I want to take a moment, and this is getting away a little bit from the information that's pertinent to my friends here, and more to some of you who might be engaging with the media as sources. And I want to talk about why student journalism is really, really important, and why, even though you may not always like what the Western Herald publishes or what the radio station has on their shows, you should still engage when you're asked to be a source. One is that the student media is really a surrogate for the student body. And we see this in the case law, right? We see that the case law says the media are proxies for the public. The media are the ones who are doing the digging. They're doing the public records requests, and they're telling you what the budget looks like, and they're telling you what hiring situations look like. And they're reporting on Title IX and sexual assault issues on campus, and all these really important issues that you probably wouldn't know about unless the Western Herald published an article about it. And so when you don't invest in that, that's going to dry up, and so that's one reason. Another is that across the country, we've seen a lot of local news really shutter, right? Local news has totally shrunk. Newspapers that used to be alive and well, dailies and communities, are going fully online or just completely shutting down, and student media has really stepped up in a lot of communities. I'm thinking one example that I just worked with last week, and some of you who may have been with us at 10 a.m. this morning may have heard about this example a little bit, but just last week I was working with the Ashland Collegian at Ashland University over in Ohio, and the Ashland Times-Gazette there has shut down, doesn't have an editor, doesn't have any, technically there's still an Ashland Times-Gazette, but there's no editor and there's no reporter, so I'm not exactly sure how they're running that newspaper. But this Ashland Collegian, the student newspaper there, has their paper in the grocery store in town, has their paper in the drugstore in town, and it's really become the community paper. And so it's not just for the campus community that this is an important conduit for the student body, but it's also an important conduit for the community in general. And I think this is a big one for folks who might be in more administrative roles. Why should you talk to student journalists? Because it promotes trust and accountability and transparency. Do you want to be known as the person who's giving the cold shoulder to the conduit of your student body? Probably not. Not a great look, right? Especially on a campus like Western Michigan, which I'm not saying this is happening here. For the record, I haven't gotten any calls from the student journalists here. But at a campus that really prides itself in being pro-free expression, I think it's really important to live that by investing in these young journalists that you have here and giving them the information that they need in order to flourish. Now, I think I mentioned earlier that one of the big types of censorship of student media that we see on campus is these policies that say, hey, you can't talk to the Western Herald unless you get prior permission from your boss. We see these a lot with student employees, like resident assistants. Sometimes it's in their contracts that they have to clear this. We see it with faculty, we see it with other employees. And a big thing to know about these is, as much as these policies are common, they're something that I deal with almost every week, they are unconstitutional, okay? Under the First Amendment, employees of a public institution have the right to speak publicly, including speak to the media, speak to reporters, as long as these three things are met. So as long as they're speaking in their individual capacity. So that means they're not purporting to represent WMU in that conversation. So like, for example, an RA who says, there's mold in my dorm room, it's really gross, I'm really freaked out about living in this dorm room because there's mold. That person's not speaking on behalf of the housing department in that capacity, right? They're saying, I don't like living in this room where there's mold growing on my walls. That's an individual concern. That's different from them saying, well, the way that the housing department is going to deal with the mold is X, Y, and Z. That might be more in the capacity of representing WMU. So they have to be speaking in their individual capacity. It has to be related to a matter of public concern. Essentially, is it newsworthy, right? Something that is like black mold in campus dorms, probably a public concern. Something that is more like, hey, I don't really like my roommate, maybe not so much a public concern. And then it can't adversely affect the institution's ability to do its basic functioning, right? And when we think about the basic functioning of an educational institution, usually that's things like teaching the students, right? Being an educational place. And so something like disclosing confidential student information, right, would prevent the university from being able to fulfill its mission as an educational institution. So that same RA couldn't say, well, the girl down the hall whose name is Susie also doesn't like the black mold in her dorm, because that might be revealing where Susie lives, which might be confidential information, right? So I think this is a really big thing to know when you're talking about interfacing with student media as a conduit for expressive freedoms on campus. If you have policies like this, or even practices, sometimes they're not written policies, but just sort of an understanding that we're not really supposed to talk to student journalists unless we have clearance. When you have those types of practices, it really creates a situation where there's a culture of silence. And that's not going to end just with, oh, don't talk to student journalists. That's going to turn into don't talk to anyone. And that's going to reflect in all of the survey work that we do at FIRE that we've been talking about all day, with how comfortable students are with discussing various controversial topics on campus. I think I like to always touch on, with rights comes responsibilities. I know that that's kind of an old, silly adage that is a little bit cliche, but it's also really true, right? I'm not standing here saying that our friends over here have, no role in this whatsoever, that they're always right. Although, on the DL, I really think the student journalists are mostly always right. But in reality, we're all human, right? And they certainly have responsibilities, like, publishing the truth, not publishing defamatory material, like, not stealing people's copyrighted information. And then we also have these ethical obligations. And I think that's where we can start talking about a little bit more, what does this look like for a culture of free expression on campus, and what are the ethical obligations, not necessarily the legal obligations, of a student media or student medium to foster that type of environment on campus. We've had some of these controversies come through where, this student newspaper wouldn't publish this person's editorial, and that's not a First Amendment issue. because the rights of a student publication are vested in its editors. So those editors get to decide what gets published and what doesn't get published. But is it a question of, are those editors fostering that culture of free speech and free expression that ultimately also benefits the student press? And that's an open question. Like, I'm not saying that the answer is, you should publish every editorial that ever gets sent to you. But I'm saying, let's think about that, right? What is your obligation as student journalists to foster this culture of expression? I think I'm almost done, I promise you. Yes, I'm done. This is some resources that are mostly applicable to the few people in the room who are student journalists, but if you are not a student journalist, you can also go to thefire.org/alarm if you ever have a First Amendment question or issue on campus. And I'm going to shut up and open it to some discussion now.
Awesome, thank you. Did I get it? There we go. Let me look around. Any questions you might have to get us started? Yes, sir. Here, I'll walk over and share the microphone with Cully Cooper, General Manager from 89.1 Wider FM.
Hello, panel. Excellent presentation. I just have a question. How can we, as students, best promote open and free speech and conversation amongst our peers?
I think this gets back to a lot of, I'll give a little preview of what people can expect on your podcast next week. I think this gets back to a lot of what we were talking about earlier, which is, I think there's a few ways. One is assuming good faith as often as possible. When you have a disagreement with someone over a controversial issue, don't look at that person as the enemy, as the devil. Instead, look at that person as someone who has a different perspective, a different set of values, and where can I find middle ground? And even if I can't find middle ground, where can I challenge my own beliefs and my own perspectives so that I can strengthen my arguments, even if that's your goal? Having that openness to conversation, I think, is really super important. And I think that it probably plays out a lot in y'all's student media.
That's a good question. I would say that it boils down to recognizing that even though you have freedom of expression, that also comes with responsibilities, all right? So in Ghana, where I come from, there's a saying that your right ends at the tip of the nose of the other person, right? So that means that you want to make sure you're being responsible in expressing yourself, knowing that even though you have freedom of expression, you're also ensuring that the other person feels included. That means respecting their opinion, even if you disagree. And that will also come to the fact that I'm glad we're having this conversation in the context of a campus setting, right? And colleges are places where you grow as a person, you develop critical thinking skills, and these are things that you need to cultivate, the ability to listen to someone else's opinion. Even though you disagree, learn to understand their point of view and then build on that. It helps your experience. It doesn't mean you have to say yes to whatever anyone else says, but it means that you need to understand that as you are expressing your right, they also have the right to express themselves. And recognizing that, I think, would help open conversation, if you ask me.
It's really interesting. We live in a time where opinions seem to go really polarizing directions, and it seems that folks don't want to listen, and I think that's such an important part. And maybe one of the things I've always liked about Western, because that's where I'm from, got my degrees from Western, and I've spent a lot of time on this campus, of just a place to have that open expression of ideas. And while one may not be the idea that you have, it's the right of that other person to have that and express that idea, and maybe by listening you find out something you didn't know before. Maybe it helps you firm your own opinion of what you thought. And you don't have to agree, but that's where that phrase, we have to agree to disagree, comes from. But to be able to do it in a civil and respectful manner is really important. Anybody else? Thoughts, questions? Don't be shy. Go for it.
I don't know if I'm allowed to ask a question, but I do have a question for you. So, earlier I was having a conversation with Nicole about, how do you strike a balance between, recognizing that student media is owned by management of the university, and you have an obligation as a student journalist to, for instance, write about issues that affect the university, or even to an extent criticize them. How do you do that in a way where you're not telling on your bosses, but also you're maintaining journalistic integrity?
I would posit that Western Michigan University is not your boss. I think that's the number one way I would answer that question, is they might be giving you money, but that does not mean that they're your boss. And this comes from the constitutional law. The case law is very, very clear on this. We have case law going back to at least the 1970s on this question. And the courts have said, and including the Supreme Court, have said that when a institution establishes a student publication or student medium, and they give those student journalists the rights to determine the content of that student publication, that they then have to take their hands off. And it's no longer on them to determine what types of reporting you do, what types of content you publish. And instead, their role is really one of support, is one of continuing to give you that funding. Now, they can take the funding away at any time for non-content-based reasons. So they can say, you know what, this year we just really don't have the money to fund these student programs anymore, and the student media is going to get a 20% budget cut, but so is other student organizations, so is these academic departments. And they can do that, that's legal. But what they can't do is say, you know what, we really don't like how the student media has been covering Sister Cindy, is that her name? Sister Cindy, right? And so therefore, we're gonna cut your budget by 20%, or we're gonna take away all of the funding. That would be completely unconstitutional, and you could call me up, and we could sue them, and we would probably win. So I think that part of the answer to that question is getting out of the mindset that money equals authority. Because in this situation, the Constitution is an intervening factor that says absolutely money does not equal authority.
For context, Western does not fund the Western Herald or the Student Media Group 89.1 Wider FM. They're funded through a student assessment fee that the students voted on back in 2012. And so they operate as independent student groups. And from my role as essentially I'm an advisor for the Student Media Group. And while I'm staff, I can say the university is incredibly supportive of the work that the students do. And we do not get pressured to do anything other than do what you do. It's to your point of the university supporting student media. That's all that I've been able to observe from my vantage point. And that seems to be remarkable in the landscape of college media and some of the stories you read about what's happening in student media outlets across the country.
That's what I like to hear, and it is remarkable in the landscape of student media. We were talking earlier about my thesis from 2017, where I did a nationwide survey of editors of student newspapers. At FIRE, FIRE's taken that on as now a project of FIRE. We do it every 3 years, so we did it again in 2020. We're about to launch one in the spring semester this year, another survey. And in both 2020 and 2017, that survey revealed that 60% of respondents, so student editors, had experienced at least one instance of administrative censorship in the year leading up to the survey. And most of them reported only one or two incidents. but 1 or 2 incidents every year at 60% of publications across the country, and there's about 2,000 publications across the country. That's an insane number. You know, that's an epidemic.
Yeah, and student journalism is on the forefront of some of the biggest stories that are out there in the country. The one that comes to mind is Northwestern's athletics program with the football coach who wound up being fired. The student newspaper at Northwestern was the group that broke that story. And students are doing incredible work, holding their institutions accountable to the students that they serve. And to know that there's that much, I guess there's no other way, is that censorship going on across the country when there's that kind of pressure to those 60%? Is that what that's?
I call it censorship.
That's what it seems like to me.
I don't like to use that word when we're doing research, because what we find is that when you say censorship, people think that they have to have been punished, or they have to have been, had someone come and tear the newspapers off the printing presses in order for it to count. So I don't use that word when we do our research, but I absolutely call it censorship. I would love to hear from you all, if I can call you out. I mean, you're on stage, so I would love to hear a little bit about your perspectives on how does student media here at Western Michigan play into the overall climate of expressive freedoms here? How do you feel you interface with other students?
Let me just. Okay. So I have been in student journalism since 2019. I joined during my undergraduate degree, the last year of my undergraduate degree. So I didn't study journalism. I didn't study communication during my undergraduate. I was a political science student. Then I joined the student media group, and I quickly realized the power that student journalists have on campus, right? So I'll talk about issues that are affecting my immediate surroundings, for instance, sanitary conditions in residential halls, and management will strictly act on those issues. Then I quickly realized that I do have some power, and with great power, as you said, comes responsibility. So a lot of students are looking up to us in student media, for instance, here at Western, to make them aware of issues, surrounding them. And I've been here just a year, so I wouldn't say I know what Western has been reporting yet since. But I think so far from what I've observed, I think we are doing as much as we can. From the perspective of WIDA, for instance, WIDA is giving opportunity for every student, come express yourself however you feel like doing. Okay, so host a show if you want to. When I was coming here, I just reached out to Kali and told him that I am an African student coming to the US. Okay, so I'm thinking about doing something that showcases my culture or my background. What do you think? And he says, we are open to ideas. Whatever you think you can do, bring it on board. So I decided maybe expressing myself through African culture in music would be a best way to do that. And he gave me the opportunity to do that. So kudos to you on that. But that goes to tell how much open the student media is for expression for other people as well. And WIDA holds several shows, so different shows about different issues. I think if more people can reach out, tell you that I want to talk about this. I want to talk about, for instance, the LGBT rights on air. In the spring semester, I interviewed people from the LGBTQ+ office, talking about their experiences on campus, and I had them share a number of issues. I feel like these are things that they can decide to create a show for us to talk about. Okay, so I'm glad that for our part, we have an open door, even at WIDA. That's what I'm talking about, for people to come express themselves. But it also boils down to people being aware of these opportunities that they have with student media.
Yeah, at the Western Herald, our slogan is for the students, by the students. And so we always are trying to get out news, as it says, for the students. As students ourselves, we hear like what other students want to hear, what questions they have. We get emails all the time asking like, can you, like, my RSO did this cool thing, or like, can you report about this event that's going to happen? And assuming we have the capability, we always get a reporter out there. So yeah, very similar to what Daniel said, just getting, when students reach out to us, letting us know that they want to hear something, we get that for them. And sometimes, like, just like looking into what people tell us,
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think that both of your comments are really illustrative of what the role of student media really can be, which is, by the students. It's about what the students want to hear and what the students deserve to hear. And I also want to comment on the what you said about, management getting upset. I tell student journalists all the time that if people aren't upset with you, you're not doing your job. Like, part of the job of a journalist is to piss people off sometimes. Not that you're going out trying to piss people off, right? That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is, when you're digging for the truth and you're revealing uncomfortable information, people are going to be upset sometimes. And you have to develop a thick skin, which is hard. But, kind of one of the themes of today, of, all of the events that Joe and I have been doing today, has been free speech is hard work. It is uncomfortable. It is inherently uncomfortable. And it's not always fun, but it's necessary. Not everything that is good is easy. And I think free speech really falls into that category.
What other questions or comments might you have? I feel like I'm sitting here with the mic too much. Yes, sir. Here we go.
So I find it really interesting that as student leaders in our media, you find that there's more open expression. But data from FIRE and other surveys show that a majority of students on Western's campus and other campuses are, in FIRE's words, uncomfortable sharing their opinions or feelings on particular issues. How do we combat that? How do we create an environment where we welcome free speech, but that means listening to people that we disagree with? And what role maybe can student media play in fostering that environment?
I think some of that may come from being more comfortable to share our thoughts and our opinions ourselves through our media. Obviously, like reporting the facts and getting that straight, and if you report an editorial labeling it as that and recognizing that that's our opinion. Just being very open and straightforward about the facts too, and not trying to, I'm not saying we do this, but like just making sure that we don't write a story in a way just to make things look good, or vice versa. But then also giving other students the opportunity on our platforms to be able to share their opinions themselves. I know at the Western Herald we're trying to lean more into opinion pieces. Just allowing other students, if they would like to step in on that and be able to express themselves and have that conversation, to be welcoming for them to do that and helping them along the way.
Before I get into the student media's role in all of that, I just want to speak on the issue in general in terms of people not being able to express themselves on campus. I feel like it all comes down to being aware of your rights. And I'm glad we're having a program like this where we trying to educate people on their rights. I mean, I know a lot of Americans know these, the amendments and whatnot, but I think it all comes down to being aware as an individual that this is how much power, how much right I have to express myself within any given context. Students over the years have been at the forefront of social movement and activism wherever. You can make mention of several. From my point of view, even currently, if you Google Ghana right now, the major news outlets will be reporting on protests that are currently happening against the government, right? During the Black Lives Matter movement, students stood up and said, enough is enough. You've had in Iran, for instance, the mandatory wearing of hijab. It took the young generation to, it does not, sometimes it's not, I think we usually see expression in terms of what you can physically do, but we are in a digital age, so we are social media generation, and sometimes it means that utilizing these mechanisms to express ourselves. Yes, social media has its own challenges, with free speech being restricted here and there, and wrong marks being criticized and whatnot, but it's a great tool for expressing ourselves. I think people need to be aware of the various mechanisms. It may not mean hitting the streets and saying that I demand to be respected in this manner. It may mean starting an online, I don't know the word for it, but basically an online protest, an online movement. And these have been proven to be very successful when it comes to demanding for right or expressing yourself. So people need to be more aware of these other avenues when it comes to expressing themselves. But on the score of student media, I believe we're doing something, but more can be done, honestly, because I feel like we're not touching more on. So a lot of student media that I have seen usually lean more towards entertainment than they lean more towards political issues, topical issues that people want to share their views on, people want to talk about. And I think that's one way we can improve collectively as student media, where we are reporting, for instance, what's happening with regards to student governance on campus, what's happening with regards to student administration or politics nationally. We should be able to, as a student media, contribute to discussions like this. It makes people comfortable to want to share. We have a responsibility to educate. So when I'm saying let's be aware of avenues of our rights, it also behoves on student media, for instance, to have shows where they discuss, these are your rights, these are your responsibilities, these are issues that you should care about. And I feel like if we normalize that culture, people will freely express themselves.
I think one thing, if I may, that plays into this question is what I was saying earlier, that it's sort of the job of journalists to piss people off. And journalists, because of that, are a really persnickety crowd. And so it's harder to pressure student journalists, I think, into self-censorship than it might be for the general student body. And the data backs that up. The survey that I was talking about of student media editors, what we found is that the censorship attempts happen 60 to 60% of these publications at least once or twice a year. But most of the time, it doesn't result in self-censorship. They push back. And so I think that's a big part of it. Is I wonder whether there's a role for student media and for student journalists to help their fellow students gain those skills of, being willing to be a little bit uncomfortable. Because it's uncomfortable, right? You write a story and people are pissed off at you. I mean, that's not a nice position to be in, and I'm sure you've both been in that position. That's uncomfortable, and it's similar to a position that a student might be in if they speak up with an unpopular opinion in class, and now their professor or their peers, are looking down on them. And I wonder if I really think a big part of it is getting that skill of how do I live in that discomfort, and how do I be okay with not everyone always liking me or or agreeing with me. And I wonder if student journalists might have a role in teaching their peers that skill, because I think student journalists are really good at that by necessity.
That's a fascinating point, and I was going to say one of the things that's, to answer your question, what can student media do? Well, I think continuing to develop the training and development programs for all of the student media outlets is a critical part of that, and helping to develop what you're talking about, Lindsay, is like, how do you get students who are coming in who are not, grizzled veterans of the news desk or the journalism world? They're just people who are interested in doing that, don't have the experience that, say, a professional journalist has, and aren't necessarily expecting some of the crap that comes at them in ways that, and I find it funny because I'm going through some of the archives of material from our old Space and fonts, and there were letters that were written, typed letters or handwritten letters complaining about an article that was written in the Western Herald. Now, it's like, we're on 5 to 7 different social media platforms. The radio station has an on-air app, website, all of the social media things. And there are so many different channels for someone to build up their keyboard courage and share a thought that isn't super pleasant to a student who is just coming in trying something. And how do we help students understand that those, I'll call them attacks, you can navigate those and help yourself get better at what you're doing, and those do not have to stick with you forever. That those are, I guess that's another example of what I would call crap. It's like that's what that is. It's just somebody yapping. It doesn't always, have to sink in so hard. Yes. Here we go. I got the mic.
You guys are talking a lot about how students are afraid to share their opinion on some topics. How do you feel about there's an app that a lot of people use on campus called Yik Yak. I don't know if you know what that is. How people I feel are more comfortable to say what they feel because they're not going to be judged by other people from what they're saying. How do you feel about opinions being said that you might not know who's saying it, and you can agree with the opinion or not?
Yeah, I'm old enough to remember when I was in college when Yik Yak was really popular, and then when Yik Yak went under because everyone there was so much toxicity on Yik Yak, and then in my career when Yik Yak came back, so now we're there. We all thought it was dead, but it's not. Anonymous speech is sort of bedrock to our principles of freedom of expression in this country. And I just said that Yik Yak can be incredibly toxic, and I think we can admit that both can be true, right? I don't know. I haven't looked at Yik Yak in a long time, 10 years, so maybe it's not as bad as it used to be. But it used to be pretty wild stuff that was posted on there. But like I said, anonymous speech is really at the center in some ways of our history of free expression in this country. And it can be a really important tool for folks who are in the minority to be able to speak up and share their truth without as much fear of retribution. And so I think it has a really important role, even if it might come with, some volatility that we don't always, love. I think it's worth it. That's another one of those places where things that are good aren't always easy, right?
I just wanted to say that it basically ties into my idea of making use of digital media for expressing yourself. So you're right. I don't know the app though, but I'll just think of it in terms of social media. It's a social media platform, right? Is it social media? Yeah. Okay, great. So I think it's a good way of expressing yourself. Like I said, we are a social media or digital media generation, and we need to make use of that. Okay, so the old ways of expressing ourselves may not be effective these days. That means that we need to explore alternatives. If you're more comfortable expressing yourself via a social media platform, why not do it? I think you should go for it. We just have to be responsible in doing that. Like Lisa just said, some people may type wild things about that. So it comes down to being a responsible person, knowing that even though I am sending this text anonymously, I am not infringing on someone else's right. I'm not promoting hateful speech to the other person who is reading it. Okay, so that if I am, for instance, a black person like me, if I am calling for my rights to be respected, I'm not being hateful to a white person, for instance. So you need to be responsible in the way that you go about using such platform, but definitely they are good.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like it's gotten a lot easier to hide behind the anonymity of being able to express your opinion, and I think that can be good to give people that platform and feel safe doing so. I think it's a little bit unfortunate that people don't feel like they can express their opinion without that kind of blanket of anonymity sometimes. As long as, like Daniel said, like if you're being responsible, as long as you're not using that opinion to twist facts to go after someone personally, sharing your opinion, whether it's anonymous or not, can be very powerful in
Yeah. Are there other questions? I
I
can
had no
like-
idea that
You
Yik
share
Yak was
some.
back. I remember it was probably 2014, 15 that was the thing. Is it just back now? Yeah, it seems like maybe the folks that were into it
Well,
in middle school. Or
Remember
maybe
before
getting
Yik Yak, there was a Confessions Facebook pages.
Oh.
Anybody remember those?
So people tend to stick to media outlets that report information that they agree with, and they will avoid media that reports on information they don't agree with. So how do you, as a journalist, deal with people not wanting to listen to you because you're not saying things that align with their political beliefs?
I'm going to let the journalist answer that question.
That's a tough one. So you're asking how do we deal with people not, liking your media outlet because it does not align with their political views. Okay. I think that's true. I feel like it's not just here, but all over the world. It's usually a polarized political system where people belong to one or the other, and there's nothing wrong with that. That means that people may not like what you write about, but you do your job regardless. As long as you're presenting the fact, as long as you're reporting on what is true, then I feel like it's to attract people to come. People who are serious about learning, who are open-minded, you definitely want to read your piece if you are doing a good job. Unless you yourself are also being one-sided or biased in your reportage, then obviously you're going to lose people from the other spectrum. So it boils down to media, it boils down to being unbiased in media as a journalist. You know, your credibility is most important, and for you to be able to unite different kinds of listeners or different kinds of readers, it means that you have to show them that you are truly unbiased or you are truly neutral. And so I don't think there's much you can talk about it rather than upholding journalistic standards of neutrality. That's the best you can do. You cannot force people to listen to you.
I think I'm going to answer the question even as a non-journalist, but I think the other thing is that student media shapes the conversation on campus more than sometimes people think it does. So just because, John Smith didn't read the article in the Western Herald doesn't mean he's not going to hear about it, or hear about the issue that you wrote about, So I think that's a really important part of this conversation is that someone's going to read it. And then that person is going to say to their friend, oh my gosh, have you heard about this budget deficit that we're facing? And then that friend is going to be like, oh my, does that mean our professors are going to be laid off? And a conversation is going to start from there. And only one person has to have read that story or watched that story or listened to that story in order for it to sort of be a trickle out to the rest of the campus community.
On a journalistic front, it's that willingness to try, to really try and do quality work, continue to ask those questions. Because to your point about it's hard to get through, there are algorithms, and it's maybe one of the good things about social media is that help you find the things that you're into. They can direct you to other things that you might like, but at the same time, there's the shadow side of that. If you're only into this one thing, then you never get exposed to that other side. And so one of the things that I would like to encourage is be curious and remain open-minded to other points of view. And if you're not already, to explore what I'll say the other side is saying, so that at least you have an idea of what's happening out there and you're really working to be more well-rounded, more informed, and just a better consumer of the information that's out there.
A quick one. I just wanted to say that, for us journalists, I think we also have a great responsibility to make sure that we position ourselves as an authoritative source. So for instance, the student media here on campus should be every student go-to for stories that concern at least the university community. We should be the most credible, the first point of contact for such stories. It shouldn't be Michigan Radio or any other radio, right? These are good radio stations or good media houses, but we should position ourselves in a way where we are on top of issues that are in our immediate community. That way, people have no choice than to listen to us, even if they do not agree with us. They know that we are usually on top of issues that affect our immediate surroundings, so they have no choice than to listen.
Broad question, but when we're talking about free speech, how far do we say free speech goes? Like, for example, as student journalists and just students in general, if there's an event on campus that is having hate speech, do we cover that and it potentially harm someone or a group again?
Yeah, we've been talking about this a lot today, the idea of hate speech and the confines of free speech. And I think, the thing to know from a legal perspective is in this country, hate speech is protected speech, generally speaking. There's some exceptions, but unless it falls into one of the categories of unprotected speech, which would be things like harassment or defamation, it's going to be protected by the First Amendment. And I think this also goes back to what I was saying earlier about free speech being hard. There's that old adage, and we talked about this at our 3 o'clock panel for any of you who were there. I'm sorry that this is going to be repetitive, but there's that old adage that sticks and stones may break your bones, but words can never hurt you. And I think most of us will agree that that's not really true, right? Words can hurt. Words are powerful. And that's part of why we believe in the First Amendment, right? Because words are powerful. So those both can be true, right? That hate speech is protected by the First Amendment legally, and that words can still cause harm. I think for me, the reason that I am still, or one of the reasons that I really believe in this system in which, even though I recognize that speech can be hurtful, that I really believe in this system that in which hate speech is generally protected by the First Amendment is because if you want to disallow hateful speech, then you have to come up with a definition of what that means. And someone in power is going to come up with that definition. So, Joe, I'm going to steal your exercise that you gave to folks at the 3 p.m. because I really liked it, which is that you take a moment to think about the politician that you think is just the worst politician, right? It's going to be someone different for different folks in this room. And then think about how they would define hate speech. You know, are you comfortable with that? I'm not comfortable with that. And so at the end of the day, you know, I'm going to let the journalists talk about the question of like covering, you know, hateful speech. But I think that our system, which calls for counter speech rather than censorship. So instead of, you know, saying, you know, this person can't say racist speech on campus, instead of saying that, say, well, we're going to be louder with the anti-racist speech on campus. You know, our system that calls for counter speech instead of censorship, I really think is a better system because it doesn't put, one reason being is because it doesn't put that power in the hands of our changing political system to determine what is and isn't protected.
I'll say that for journalists, a good journalist will report on any and every issue, right? But there's also something called like agenda setting or framing. So, like Lindsay said, you decide on which one you highlight them or which one you put spotlight on which of the stories. So is it the one you consider hateful speech? You have the power as a journalist to direct the conversation, and this is where you put that to use. But you also have to be careful not to decide that I'm not going to project a particular discussion or a particular topic because I do not agree with it or because I feel like it's hateful speech. Because what you consider hateful speech may not be hateful speech to the other person. So if you're unsure, I think that the person you is channel, yes, you're covering all right, you're going to report all right, but maybe focus more on more positive, counter positive speech. I feel like that might diffuse the situation a bit so that whoever is on the hateful part does not feel like you're silencing them, and the other person might not also feel like you are promoting hateful speech.
As journalists, our job is to be unbiased as much as we can, and so choosing to kind of censor that hate speech is wrong. We may see it as like we don't agree with it. Our job isn't necessarily to decide what we agree with and what we don't agree with to show people what's happening. Our job is to show people what's happening. I think part of our job is also looking to put in the work to find different viewpoints, to find as many people as we can that have different opinions, to show all ways of thinking around the subject. So I don't think shying away from hate speech that's happening is the best choice because people don't view what is actually happening, but rather informing people and then allowing people give a platform to that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think another aspect to this is that you want to know who the people in the room are who have, you know, those positions, right? In some ways, it's important to understand the landscape of perspectives on your campus and even perspectives that you disagree with because it's important for you to know who and what you're up against. So if it never gets out what someone said that was hateful, then that person, you know, gets to have those perspectives in private and not be challenged. challenged because other folks don't know that they said what they said. And I think that's another important part of this. And, we've seen this happen in some European countries, for example, that have banned hate speech. I mentioned this earlier, but like in Germany, they have a huge problem with underground white supremacy. And, by making certain perspectives or speaking on certain perspectives illegal, they've actually pushed that further underground, and those people become entrenched in their views because they're only talking to their white supremacist friends, and they're not being published in the newspaper where other people can say, hey, that's not right, and here's what it, and have a meaningful debate with them. So we have to have that stuff out in the open, because that's the only way that we can really combat, perspectives that you may disagree with.
So how does censorship differ from like a private student run group versus like a group like in the journalism? So like if I started my own group, like, for example, like how would black censorship by the university be different? Like could I be censored by the university because I'm a student?
No. So the question, I had a hard time hearing you, but I think what you were saying is that if you started a student group that was maybe not an RSO or is an RSO, it doesn't actually really matter at the end of the day. An independent.
Was like publishing things opinions by other students.
Oh, okay.
Would that be able to be censored by the university?
So like if you started a blog or a newsletter that you wanted to distribute on campus that was independent, didn't get any like student monies, anything, would you have the same rights? Or would you be able to be censored by the university? And that was what I said. The answer is no, you would not be able to be censored by the university. This is a public institution that is bound by the First Amendment. The rights of journalists are the same as the rights of any other student on campus, for the most part. And that means that you could totally, start your own student publication or your own student debate group or your own, book club, and you could talk about pretty much whatever the heck you want to talk about, so long as it's not unprotected speech. And you would have a right to, at least in, public spaces on campus, distribute that information. You have a right to go out and leaflet on campus. You have a right to go out and get on your soapbox and speak on campus. You have a right to have a protest on campus. These are all things that are absolutely guaranteed to you as an American or as someone who is in America on a public institution campus.
There was actually, I'll say the Western Herald has been a student-run publication since 1916. But there was a time, and I don't have the dates off the top of my head, I want to say late 60s into the early 70s, there was an alternative to the Western Herald called the Western Activist. And you can read a lot of that on the university libraries, has a digital collection of all the Western Heralds and through the Western Activist, which is pretty interesting to check out. You have a question?
My question to you is, since you're the legal expert here, how do you regulate? Should free speech be regulated first of all? If so, how do you regulate it in a way that it's not censorship, but you're also making sure people are being responsible?
I'm pretty comfortable with where the courts have come down on this question. So the question, I think, could people hear him? Okay, the question was, I don't think that mic is working. Is it? Eat it, essentially.
Is it better? Okay, so let me repeat the question then. I was asking, how should free speech be regulated? If so, how do you go about it without making it seem like you're censoring people?
Okay, and what I'm saying is that I'm pretty comfortable with where the courts have come down on this question of should free speech be regulated? The answer is a little. So there are some types of regulation of free expression that are okay under the First Amendment. The first is time, place, and manner restrictions. So essentially this means that, WMU, for example, can regulate the time at which you have your protest, the place to an extent where you have your protest, and the manner in which. So for example, they can say, constitutionally, that you cannot have a super loud protest in front of residence halls at 2 in the morning because people are trying to sleep and they have class the next day, right? They can probably say, you can't bring an entire stage into whatever you call your lawn here, you know, in order to have your event without first clearing it with the institution, because that's a manner, right? That bringing a whole stage is a big old deal, and we want to at least have a conversation with you about that. They can probably say that, you know, you can't have your protest in the classroom, you know? You need to take it outside and not be disrupting a class, right? Those are time, place, and manner restrictions. Those are okay. They have to be content, viewpoint neutral, so they can't say, oh, well, you know, the Students for Life can protest in a classroom during a class, but the pro-choice students cannot. It would have to be no protest in classes at all, right? But I'm comfortable with that. I think that's fine. The other way that free speech is regulated under our current legal system is that there are certain categories of unprotected speech. So things like true threats. I cannot, you know, with seriousness and intent come up to you and say, I'm going to kill you, and get away with that. That is not free speech. We talk about like defamation, right, as a category of unprotected speech. So I cannot intentionally say something totally fake about the president of this university and expect to not get sued and have to pay a bunch of money. Child pornography is another unprotected category of speech that I am personally, as a mother of a 1-year-old, fairly comfortable with. What you can't do, and part of the reason that I'm comfortable with those categories, even though I'm not comfortable with hate speech as a potential category, is those are pretty well defined in our case law, right? Like, I think we all have pretty good agreement about like what, for example, child pornography is, right? That's an easy one in a lot of ways. But even something like a true threat, I mean, there's a little bit of debate around the fringes. You know, we get into some of these conversations about like music lyrics, can they be true threats or are they not true threats? But I think really at the end of the day, looking at, did the person intend it to be threatening? You know, I think that's a pretty good definition that we've had for a while now, and it's pretty clearly established and harder to abuse. I think coming up with a new definition for something as sort of nebulous as hate speech is a much harder burden, and I don't have the confidence that it would end up going well.
What would you like my biggest takeaway to be from coming here today?
Can I have different ones for different populations? Can I choose like 3? Okay, he says yes. Okay, great. First takeaway, I think for student journalists, my biggest takeaway is that like you are important and you are protected, and call me if you need me. And I think for those of you who aren't in student media, my biggest takeaway is I want you to recognize the importance of expressive freedoms on campus and how student media is sort of a proxy of that. And value what you have in your independent student publications here, and take lessons from that. Was that more than, I don't know, that was like 6 things, so I apologize. Is that helpful? Are there other questions? Don't be shy.
All right, we won't force it out of you. Yeah, I would just say from a takeaway standpoint, you don't have to be an aspiring journalist to be curious and to ask questions. That can really help keep the conversation going. So don't stop. Don't give up.
Do you all take letters to the editor? The Western Herald? No? Yes? Oh, okay, but if you got them, I mean, I think that's like one way, like if you accept submissions for that kind of thing, that's one way that students can engage with their student media that maybe it would be like a good thing to happen more often, right? If you have something to say, you don't necessarily have to be on staff. You know, you could potentially submit a letter to the editor and use that platform.
Okay, I'll use this opportunity to offer a takeaway too. So, We Talk, your program here on campus, you know, we want to celebrate free speech on campus. We should celebrate free speech. We want open inquiry on campus. We want you to be able to challenge a professor or challenge a student, but find a way to do it where you're going to listen and you're going to learn. And viewpoint diversity is important too. It's important to have people around you that you learn from that maybe think differently. So I hope that you'll all come to future We Talk events and learn about those kind of things. Thanks.
All right. Well, let's have a round of applause for our panel. Daniel Abel, Nicole Morehouse from the Western Herald, and Lindsay Rank. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here.